What happens once Bitcoin hits 100K at some point? Will that just be the trigger for a mass sell-off, or will that be the trigger for a lot of interest from the general public pushing it even higher?
I think it'll make headlines. I think that's the thing, is it'll make headlines. Whenever it hits 100K, there likely will be some form of a sell-off. I think the bigger question is, will money flow into the rest of the cryptoverse, right? You've seen other assets like Ethereum and a lot of the altcoins really lag behind Bitcoin for the last few years. And one of the reasons...
Bitcoin, altcoins, crypto space, where is the entire industry headed? Well, Bitcoin is now again at $90,000 on Monday. We retraced 90,000 last week. It dipped below that, and now it's back. Where is it headed next? We'll find out. Ben Cowen is here to break down his forecast and analysis, founder of Into The Cryptoverse. Welcome back, Ben. Good to see you.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here as always.
Benjamin was on the show a couple months ago. People can check out that interview, link down below. Earlier in the summer, Ben, you were on the show. You had called for Bitcoin dominance to retest 60%.
But I don't really think it's going back up to 70%. My target on Bitcoin dominance has just been 60%. And the reason for that is because I basically think that when you get these major alt seasons that occurred in 2021, a lot of times when you get these breakdowns, the metric will then slowly go back up to the point of the breakdown.
I believe we're there. I'll let you share your screen. It said, 59.7, 60%. And let's just talk about that because it has hit your forecast. A good call there. I wonder what's next. If you look historically, if you zoom out and look at where it's been before the 2021 altcoin boom, it was at much higher levels. So assuming things normalize, I would say maybe 70% makes sense, but I'll let you answer that. What makes sense to you now?
Personally, I don't think it's going to go all the way up to where it was previously at 73%. One of the reasons for that is because the stablecoin market cap is a lot higher today than it was back in 2020. And I think you could also sort of view the stablecoin market as a relative flight to safety, just as people might treat Bitcoin as a flight to safety within the own crypto asset class. 60% was my target because it was essentially just retracing where the bubble began with alt Bitcoin pairs. So altcoins really started to surge against Bitcoin in the post-halving year of 2021. And I was just thinking, hey, at the very least, we'll see Bitcoin dominance come back up to that level that it was at in 2021. The one thing to remember about Bitcoin dominance is that it tends to spend 3 years going up and then 1 year going down. So we've seen that now for a couple of cycles. You have your 2017 big drop by Bitcoin dominance. You also have the big drop in 2021. And then you can see that there's sort of 3 years in between where Bitcoin dominance goes up. And I think what ends up happening is people keep sort of making these premature calls for alt season, where Bitcoin dominance goes down. But when you look at Bitcoin, the Bitcoin dominance chart, you can actually pretty clearly see, where alt season is and where Bitcoin season is, right? So alt season is essentially these areas right here where Bitcoin dominance is aggressively dropping. And that's alt season. Bitcoin season is where Bitcoin dominance is just generally trending higher. And that's something we've essentially been in now for the last 3 years. My expectation from here, 60% was always my target. So I don't really feel like it has to go higher. But one of the reasons it very well could go higher is we still do actually have alt Bitcoin pairs historically off their historic lows. So if you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, normally they retrace back to around, let's call it 25% of Bitcoin's market cap down here. And, right now they're at 0.39. And we actually saw a very similar rally by alt Bitcoin pairs in mid-November of 2020 as well. And so I'm sort of thinking right now that there's a chance that Bitcoin dominance has already topped because it did make it to 60%. But I do want people to be aware that we saw a very similar rally by alt Bitcoin pairs back over here in November of 2020. And then in December of 2020, we saw one final drop by altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. So that would correspond to potentially one final surge in Bitcoin dominance. And then one last thing about it is, I do think it makes a lot of sense to look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins, and this is basically a chart that approximates that. And so these are the two paths that I would think about for Bitcoin dominance. One path is where the top is already in and it just kind of hangs around these highs for a couple more months. By the way, excluding stablecoins, the target was around 65%, right? So it's 60% including stables, 65% excluding stables. So I think one option is it just kind of hangs out around these levels for the rest of the year and then goes down in 2025. Or you could see sort of a pop by it above this wedge, and then it goes down in 2025. And I think either of those two scenarios are somewhat equally likely at this point. My base case is Bitcoin dominant stays relatively strong for the end until the end of the year, and then perhaps starts going down in 2025.
Okay, so to break down the dominance forecast and analysis, we have to look at two sides of the equation, the Bitcoin side and then the altcoin side. Let's focus on the Bitcoin side first, and then I do have some questions on the altcoin market for you later on in this interview. Bitcoin, $90,000. It's been hovering around $89 to $92,000 ever since basically Trump won the election. I'll let you comment on that because in the past, when Bitcoin hits a new record, it has been volatile at the record highs, but it's been consolidating for the last week and a half. So, what is this price action that we're seeing right now? Is it waiting for a breakout, or is this just kind of the psychological ceiling here?
It might be doing what it's actually been doing all year long, and that's essentially where it sort of gets a rally up into say like halfway through the month, and then it pauses for a couple of weeks and then waits for the labor market data to come in. Remember, the markets don't really need a reason to go up. They just tend to go up over
Mhm.
long periods of time. You need a reason to go down. And you can see that anytime Bitcoin had a rally throughout 2024, it would often sort of stall out a little bit as you got later into the month, right? So here is early April, and then here is early June, and then here is early August. And if you overlay the unemployment rate onto the chart, you will see that where Bitcoin started to put in those lower highs, that was exactly where the unemployment rate really started to move up. And then once the unemployment rate started to move back down, that's ultimately where Bitcoin was able to break out. So earlier, just a month or so ago, we saw Bitcoin break to the upside and then consolidate, wait for the labor market data to come in just to make sure everything was good to go, right? That the unemployment rate wasn't accelerating back upwards. And when it came in at 4.1%, the market, Bitcoin's not going to wait around forever, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so then it took that opportunity to go up. So we could be doing the same thing right now, right? I mean, Bitcoin just had a very explosive move to the upside. And by the way, David, this is actually really similar to what we saw last cycle as well, right? I mean, last cycle we had almost an identical setup with Bitcoin, especially if you overlay gold with. And I think I spoke with your audience about this previously. Basically, during these cycles, it seems like Bitcoin sort of puts in a mid-cycle top, if you want to call it that, whenever gold breaks out. And it kind of did the same thing back in March of this year, where when gold broke out right here in 2019, that sort of marked a mid-cycle top, just like it did here in
Yes.
2024, right? It's almost the exact same thing. And then after that, then Bitcoin basically consolidated for about 6 months. I mean, in fact, David, it's almost the exact same amount of time until it broke out here, right? It was about 30 weeks in 2019. And then if you look over here in 2024, what you'll see is it's almost the exact same thing. It really just continues to be a carbon copy. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to fix this really quick. It really just continues to be a carbon copy of what we saw last cycle. So if you take a look at sort of this trend line here and how long it took for Bitcoin to break out of this, it was about 30 weeks, right? I mean, so it's really similar to what we saw last cycle. And so the consolidation right now that we're seeing, it could just be in anticipation of what's going to happen in 2 weeks, right? And if the by the way, just to give my sort of thoughts on that,
Hmm.
if if the labor market data comes in good again, um, so a month ago I was thinking that we would likely continue to go up and follow the cyclical view of Bitcoin. if the labor market data comes in good. And what I mean by this cyclical view of Bitcoin, if you look at things just as simple as like year to date ROI, like 2024 compared to 2016 and 2020 and 2012, normally Bitcoin goes up in Q4 of having years, right? So normally that's the cyclical view. If you look at the ROI from the bottom, for Bitcoin, you can see that normally it's around this time when it starts to make, or a month ago is normally when it starts to make the next move up. So that is the sort of the cyclical view. And so as long as the labor market doesn't give Bitcoin a reason to be concerned, then I think it will continue to follow the cyclical view. If for some reason the unemployment rate comes in higher than market expectations, then you could see Bitcoin struggle for a little bit. But as we've seen, it does tend to be resilient over the longer haul.
Okay, so when you say that Bitcoin is repeating the 2019 cycle, are you suggesting then, Ben, that there is a lot more upside to go? Because keep in mind that 2020 and 2021 was the real bull rally that happened after the Fed started cutting rates late 2018.
I think it's really hard to know exactly how much further this thing's going to go. I mean, I
Mhm.
think that the best thing the thing that I do is I stick to sort of risk levels rather than try to predict where the price is going to go. At the end of the day, I don't exactly know where the price is going to go, just to be completely
Sure.
honest. But I don't really navigate my own portfolio by trying to figure out where I think it's going to go. I look at at sort of the risk on Bitcoin right now, and so it's getting a little elevated. It's at 0.606, but it's still, I mean, just sort of isolate where it currently is. That's the chart of Bitcoin in the current risk levels that it's at compared to all the prior times in sort of Bitcoin's history where it was at similar risk levels, right? So, there's certainly times where it does continue to go up a little bit higher to some of the higher risk levels. So that's more or less what I'm following. If it does follow, look, first of all, I would say the 2019 pattern already completed, right? I mean, that was the sort of the 6 month period where you got lower highs and lower lows. Now the question is, at what point do we actually get a landing? And my guess is that you might not get a very hard landing for a while, right? I don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but I think you have to defer to the cyclical view unless the labor market gives you a reason to think otherwise. So we'll see where the unemployment rate comes in December, but I think that's the reason, right, why Bitcoin hasn't really, it's made that move to 90K and now it's kind of waiting.
The other thing that we can probably look at is the global liquidity level. Can you please overlay Bitcoin with the M2 money stock on TradingView? So I believe that's M2SL.
Are you saying to divide it by that or just to overlay it with that?
Well, we can overlay it first just to see if there's a relationship, and then later you can divide it if you like. Um, if you use a different scale, yeah, you can see over the long term, Bitcoin has risen when the money supply has also gone up. It's starting to tick up now, is kind of the point I'm trying to make, and of
Right.
course, just a greater lag effect from an increase in global liquidity. But I'll let you comment on whether or not there is a relationship, where this is just sort of a coincidence here.
I mean, I think absolutely there's relationship. I mean, it's kind of like the housing market, how house prices went up 40% in 2021, and they also increased the money supply by
Yeah.
40%. So I do think there's a lot of validity to that view of the markets. I mean, if you were to look at I actually had an approximation on here somewhere of here it is. So here's sort of the more of a global money supply, where you're not just looking at sort of the U.S., but you're also looking
Hmm.
at China, Japan, and Europe. And there you can also see something very similar, right? The money supply has been going up. The reason why it's dropped recently here is because when you convert, say, the Japanese yen or the euro or whatever, when you convert it back to US dollars, we know the dollar has been rallying a lot recently.
Sure.
So that means those local currencies have gotten weaker, which is why the global money supply has actually been dropping over the last few weeks. I think it's because of that really strong dollar. And by the way, David, this strong dollar that we're seeing right now, we saw the exact same thing. I mean, it's almost a carbon copy of 2016. Trump gets elected and the dollar rallies into the end of the year. And so too does the long end of the yield curve. I think we're seeing almost a carbon copy of what happened back then.
I think if we were to take the assumption that the dollar will continue strengthening, we can then draw a relationship between the dollar and Bitcoin if there is one. I'll let you comment on that. What has Bitcoin done in the past? Let's take 2021 to 2022, for example, when the dollar rallied from 88 DXY to basically 114. During that time, in the first half of 2021, there was a Bitcoin rally, as you know, cryptos and risk assets rally. However, all throughout 2022, while the dollar surged relative to other currencies, there was a huge collapse in risk assets in 2022. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that I think a lot of people think that every time the dollar rallies, Bitcoin has to go down, and that oftentimes is the case. But there was a period in Q4 of 2016, and this is what I was really focusing on earlier was that over here in Q4 2016, right there. So if you go look at, we can see that Bitcoin was going up right in 2016 Q4, but if you overlay the dollar, you'll see it's almost the same setup, right? I mean, you have the dollar going parabolic, just like it is now, and you have Bitcoin going up with it. So it is possible to see those two things happen simultaneously. What's more important about sort of the dollar rallying, in my view, is not. I think if everyone sort of accepts that it's impossible to predict like USD valuations, exactly where they're going to go, it's all about where do you put how do you weight your portfolio? And during DXY rallies, Bitcoin USD can sometimes go up, can sometimes go down. But what normally happens during dollar rallies is Bitcoin dominance continues to go up.
sure.
Um, and I think that it's sort of like the flight to safety, right? It's the which of these assets can handle the dollar rallying and long end rallying, and it tends to be the safer assets within each asset class, right? It's the same reason why you see, stocks like Tesla doing really, really well, but then you'll look at stocks like Rivian and Lucid, and they're still doing absolutely nothing, and they're bleeding. So I think what you're seeing a lot of the sort of the lower market cap things within each asset class bleed to the higher market cap things just because of the dollar rally, because of the yield rally, and so on and so forth. So, with Bitcoin, I guess sort of the elephant in the room, and I've talked about this a little bit, is I think it makes sense to defer to the cyclical view unless we're given a reason to believe otherwise. Um, and if you look over here at 2020, Bitcoin broke out, and yes, we did get a pandemic crash here, right? But after it broke out, it consolidated for a little while, and then eventually it continued to go up. Yes, there was this drop. So that's why sort of my argument is I think that, if there is a drop, it would likely lead to the introduction of quantitative easing again, right? And if you do get QE, then that is what would likely cause Bitcoin dominance to top. If you don't get a drop by Bitcoin, then there's probably not really a great reason for QE to begin, because the assets should help the Fed realize, when do they need to start QE, when do they not. And so I think that's the base case is, if you've just stuck with Bitcoin for the last few years, you've outperformed a majority of the cryptoverse. And you have to imagine they're not going to start QE again until they really have a great reason to do so.
Okay, well, that begs the question as to whether or not the Fed will change their course of quantitative easing. It's not technically quantitative easing. Let me rephrase that. It's not QE. They're just in an easing cycle. Do you think that will reverse course now that Trump is president and people are calling for inflationary forces like tariffs, for example, to kick in, and perhaps that will put a pause on the dovishness from the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, my guess is that QE will probably begin within the next few months, is my guess. I don't know exactly when, but I do think there will be pressures for them to start it. And I mean, just so the audience sees, it was exactly when QE began, or at least when the Fed began expanding their balance sheet last cycle. That's exactly what marked the top for Bitcoin dominance, right? I mean, that was where dominance finally topped, is when QE began. So my guess is that you will likely get QE sometime, soon. I don't know if it's going to be at the December meeting or not, but I do think you'll get it relatively soon. And that's one of the reasons why you should see Bitcoin dominance go down next year. Once, that doesn't necessarily mean that the long end has to continue to rally once QE begins. It's sort of like when the rate cuts began, right? When rate cuts got introduced, I think a lot of people were thinking that the dollar was going to crash. But I was looking at it kind of like, what happened in 2016, and we saw it was a very similar setup where the dollar was weak into September, just like it was right here. And then you got this major dollar rally that then topped out in January.
Yeah.
So my base case is that they probably will start QE within the next few months, but that doesn't mean that the dollar has to go up after QE begins. I think that a lot of this stuff gets priced in before it actually happens. So my guess is that the dollar tops out, let's say within a month and a half. I think the dollar will likely top out within the next, say, like 6 to 7 weeks, and then it'll probably do something like this, where then it goes down in 2025. So, just sort of speculating somewhat here, I would say something like this, where it kind of goes up. Everyone gets super bullish on the dollar. Everyone gets super bullish on Bitcoin dominance, and then it finally drops in the post-halving year, which is exactly what it did over here in 2017. So you have your 2016 dollar rally, sort of late 2016 dollar rally, and then it falls off in the post-halving year or the post-election year. If you're a crypto person, I guess you'd think of it as post-halving. If you're a stock person, post-election.
Right. I think I'm just going to ask you point blank then, because that's what people want to know. 100K Bitcoin by the end of the year. That's some headlines I've been reading earlier in the year. How likely is that setup now? We have, what, 6 weeks left?
I would defer to the betting markets. I think the betting markets have it at, like, I don't know, 60% likelihood. Uh, I wouldn't claim to have any insight that they don't have. I think that, if you go look at like year-to-date ROI, this is actually really interesting because if you go look at them and you average out all the prior halving years, we're actually tracking it pretty closely. So like if you average out 2012, 2016, and 2020, and then you overlay 2024, right now Bitcoin is at its average of prior halving years. So it's basically 2x
Hmm.
from the yearly open, right? It's 2x from the yearly open. The average of the prior three halving years were also 2x from the yearly open. You can see that the average from the yearly open by the end of the halving year for those was closer to 3x. So if Bitcoin can continue to follow the cyclical view, then it should be able to. I think the only thing that would prevent it from doing so would be labor market results that we're going to get in 2 weeks. So my base case, David, is if the unemployment rate comes in low, let's say it comes in at 4%, 4.1%, maybe even 4.2 would not be so bad, then it would favor the cyclical view prevailing, right? If if it comes in really hot for whatever reason, let's say it comes in at 4.3 or 4.4, then we might have to wait until 2025, for 100K. That's the way I see it right now.
What happens once Bitcoin hits 100K at some point? I'm not saying it'll happen this year or next. I don't know. We don't know. But let's speculate here. Suppose it does. It's a key psychological level. Are people just going to take profits? Well, I presume a lot of people will, but will that just be the trigger for a mass sell-off, or will that be the trigger for a lot of interest from the general public pushing it even higher?
I think it'll make headlines. I think that's the thing, is it'll make headlines. I think that whenever it hits 100K, there likely will be some form of a sell-off. A lot of times when you hit major milestones like that, there's usually some sell-off that occurs.
Mhm.
I think the bigger question is, will money flow into the rest of the cryptoverse, right? You've seen other assets like Ethereum and a lot of the altcoins really lag behind Bitcoin for the last few years. And one of the reasons is because if you look at, these are YouTube views to various crypto YouTube channels, you
Yeah.
know, you can see that even though Bitcoin has done really, really well over the last 2 years, social interest in the cryptoverse is still fairly low compared to where it was in 2021. And views in 2021 across these crypto YouTube channels were averaging around 4 million a day, right? Basically for the last 2 years, they've been averaging 1 million a day. So 25% of what they were averaging in 2021. Now we have had a few spikes to 2 million, and we're actually in one of those spikes right now. So I think that whenever Bitcoin does hit 100K, I don't know when it's going to be, but my guess is it might make people actually stick around in the cryptoverse. We've seen a lot of rallies by Bitcoin where it brings some people back, but every time that Bitcoin tops out, you can see the social interest just falls off a cliff immediately. And because it hasn't really gone high enough and led to that sort of sustained euphoria, we haven't really seen retail come back like they were here in 2021. Actually, one way to visualize this, David, is to look at the fear and greed index. If you look at anytime it's hit say 90 to 100, we hit it over here in 2019. And then that was my concern back in March, was that we were just repeating 2019, where it was just sort of like a one or two data points in the 90 to 100 range, but it's not enough to really lead to alt season, right? And now we just hit it again. We just went into the 90s again. And so the question is it just like what happened in March, or does it lead to a more sustained rally like we saw over here in November and December of last cycle? If you get something like that, then and you hit 100K, then it would likely lead to alt season in 2025. So my guess is that there will be a period where dominance goes down, but there's also a good chance that, as you say, I mean, it might not happen until after Bitcoin breaches that milestone. I mean, it's got to be a milestone that a lot of investors have in mind. I have to imagine there's a lot of people that don't want to sell until Bitcoin hits 100K.
Yeah.
So it does seem to me that that could be a milestone that whenever it's hit, then interest starts to sort of go towards some of the other cryptocurrencies, especially if it corresponds with a transition from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing.
And you discussed this in one of your more recent videos, by the way. I encourage everyone to check out Ben's YouTube channel, link down below. Great resource for Bitcoin and crypto investors. But you discussed this in one of your recent videos called Bitcoin Social Risk, in which you
Right.
talked about this exact metric: YouTube engagement, Twitter engagement, social media engagement, the retail audience engagement on social media for crypto channels. And like you said, Bitcoin has been outperforming this cycle relative to engagement. Is that a contra indicator to you, though, Ben? Does that signify too much valuation of Bitcoin, too much overbought activity? Or on the other hand, it could interpret that as being just more institutional buying, less less retail buying, and perhaps just more stability now. I don't know. How do you interpret this metric?
Well, I think Bitcoin is in a class of its own, within crypto. I mean,
Okay.
you have Bitcoin, and then you have Ethereum, and then you have everything else, right? You have everything else. And the issue for the altcoin market as it relates to their Bitcoin pairs is that, whether you have 10 altcoins, 100 altcoins, or a million altcoins, the argument is that there's still the same amount of money that's going to go into the altcoin market, no matter how many altcoins actually exist. So by printing another 10,000 altcoins, it doesn't mean that you're going to attract any more money. It just means that the money is going to get diluted from going into the other ones. So that's the reason why, unless you have this is the social risk, right? This orange line is the social risk. Unless you have a sustained rally by the social risk, like you got in 2017 and 2021, then Bitcoin dominance should go higher, right? The only way that Bitcoin dominance goes down is if you truly get an influx of retail investors, right? If you don't really get that influx, then Bitcoin dominance will continue to go up. You can actually overlay this and see exactly what I'm talking about. If you look at this is Bitcoin dominance here. Um, this is Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins.
Yes.
If you overlay the social risk onto this chart, what you'll notice is that whenever the social risk is low or dropping, Bitcoin dominance goes up. Whenever the social risk is going up, Bitcoin dominance goes down. So, in order to really see Bitcoin dominance drop, you might need to maybe hit some of those milestones, like 100K, like you mentioned, and you probably just need to see some type of larger transition in terms of monetary policy. But I mean, unless you get retail here in mass, Bitcoin dominance really has no choice but to keep going up.
What is the dominance level at which you would be confident to say altcoin season has returned?
So, look, I think with it at 60%, like the fact that it's already hit 60%, it makes sense to be aware that it could happen at any time. But the reason why I haven't yet sort of rung that bell in my own head is, and I haven't convinced myself, is because I look at alt Bitcoin pairs and I still see they're well off the range low. So if we were to get another drop by alt Bitcoin pairs down here to the range lows, and you get, say, Bitcoin dominance a few percent higher than where it is today, then I think you're definitely in the range where alt season could theoretically begin. But now we're kind of in the range where it could begin, but we also know that this same rally happened last cycle in mid-November of 2020. We saw those altcoins rally up against Bitcoin. Everyone thought it was alt season back then. And then what happened is Bitcoin ate the altcoins lunch in December. And you
Mm,
can actually see that. I mean, if you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, and you just compare 2024 to 2016 and 2020, you can see that in December of having years, Bitcoin dominance does generally go up. So I would say it's not necessarily a valuation, David. For me, it's more of a time thing. I think if you're going to get alt season, it's going to just be in 2025 is what my best guess would be. That doesn't mean that the USD valuations of altcoins can't go up. Obviously, if Bitcoin goes up between now and December, a lot of altcoins will be at higher valuations by the end of the year. But the
yeah.
point is, there's no guarantee that Bitcoin goes up, right? I mean, you could get a scary data print and then you get some form of a landing like we got in the last cycle. But the point is, no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, Bitcoin dominance will likely continue to remain strong through the end of the year. So it's not so much a level for me. It's not like it doesn't have to be any specific percent. Like it doesn't have to be 62, 63. It's just in 2025, I think is when it could theoretically happen. And one last thing, one
Hmm.
really interesting thing is if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, you actually see something really interesting where this metric tends to top out at around 82%, and you have one deviation above that level in December of the halving year. So I wouldn't be that, and you can see that this metric also had a big drop right here in November of the halving year, right? And it's having a drop right now. So I'm sort of thinking that you might get one final rally by this metric back up to the range high at the very least. And then in 2025, it goes back down. So that's what I'm thinking. I don't have an exact target to tell you for dominance. 60% has always been good enough for me, but it's important
Yeah.
to recognize that, trying to time the exact shift in the trend is really hard.
But why? Okay, let's just one more question on dominance. And I want to move on to alts. Why wouldn't Bitcoin retrace 72%? I mean, you gave a justification for 60, but why can't we return to the pre-2021 era? What fundamentally is different now versus 2020?
You're talking about Bitcoin dominance
Yes, why can't
specifically?
Bitcoin dominance go back up to 72?
Well, I mean, it could. I mean, I think one of the things that I think about is no matter, despite all the VC money and the money printing and everything else, Bitcoin dominance did not put in a lower low last cycle, right? But I do wonder if it's just going to form sort of higher lows and lower highs. I could see something like that happening where you get sort of a path that looks like this, where it just kind of does that. And
Yes.
that's what I'm thinking could happen. One of the reasons why I don't think it's going to go all the way back up to 73% is because of the stablecoin market cap, right? If you were to look at USDT market cap, right now it's at 127 billion. You know, in 2020, at a very similar time in the cycle, right? In 2020, it was at only 10 billion or so, or I guess 18 billion. So if you look at USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, it's actually at around 5%, right? It's already at five. It's at 5.5% right now. So back in 2020, if you look here, back in 2020 in December, right, a very similar time in the market, dominance of this was half of what it is now. So I think the stablecoin market could have something to do with it. If you have hundreds of billions more in stable coins today than you did back then I think that could be the reason why dominance doesn't necessarily get back up to 73%. And again, that doesn't mean that it can't. It's just that it's going to have some headwinds that it didn't have last cycle in order to really go that high. So
Yes.
my base case is that it does not make it to 73%. Um, I'm not going to say that it can't make it to 70. It just seems like it's a tall order for it to get there. I guess the sort of the elephant in the room though is that if all Bitcoin pairs do get this drop, right? If they do get this drop to the range low, from the current levels, that's 34% down. And so If that happens, then surely Bitcoin dominance would go higher than it is now.
What areas or which sectors of the altcoin market do you think may move first in this new reemergence of altcoins, whenever that may be? We're starting to see remnants of movement or traces of movement rather. XRP just jumped like think 50% more than that in the matter of a couple of days.
Right.
Dogecoin for obviously, maybe it had to do with the Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, but that jumped as well. But let's touch on XRP first. Any thoughts on this move?
Yeah, XRP was actually one that I was
Never
actually
mind. I misspoke. It wasn't 50%. It was 131%.
yeah. Yeah, I was actually talking about this on my platform 2 weeks before it happened, or a week before it happened, because it's a really common setup for altcoins to have, and it's basically when they put in double bottoms on their Bitcoin pairs. That's normally when they get spikes like this. And we also saw something very similar, although it wasn't a double bottom in 2020, and so that was why I was watching it. So if you look at 2020, there was a low by XRP Bitcoin in June, just like there was this cycle. And then there was another low in November, just like there was this cycle. So I was looking at that and then thinking, all right, well, there's a good chance that XRP Bitcoin will get a pretty big spike into late November. Now, last cycle, I just got to be honest, right? Last cycle, I took that trade, and this one as well, but last cycle I took that trade and I felt like a genius when it came up here to like 4,000 sats. I mean, it essentially doubled up overnight. And
Hmm.
then a month later, the SEC sued Ripple, and then
Yeah.
all those gains I got on the trade were gone, like they evaporated overnight. And so that's one of the reasons why, when you make these trades, when you sort of see these spikes, if they go the way you're thinking, it's important to remember that the way to be successful in crypto is to value your portfolio in Satoshis rather than US dollars. So every time you take a trade on an altcoin, by taking some of those profits back to Bitcoin, it helps preserve the long-term value. So if there is something like this that happens, right? If all Bitcoin pairs do get that final drop in December, at least you took advantage of it. But I think that's exactly what it was. It's basically just repeating the same pattern that it did in 2020. I think that the sort of the harbinger for the altcoin market
Mhm.
is ETH Bitcoin. And this is one that I've been pretty bearish on it for a long time. Um, even back over here at the merge, but I do think it's likely going to bottom out soon. Maybe probably within the net, like before the end of the year, or I would say the second week of January by the latest. But if you look at this one, once ETH Bitcoin starts going up, then Bitcoin dominance will start going down, right? Because ETH Bitcoin really helps lead the altcoin market. You can look at the last couple of cycles. 2 cycles ago, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in December of 2016, right? It bottomed in December right here of 2016. And so you have to wonder, is it going to do the same thing just 8 years later and bottom out in December of 2024? I could see that happening. And then last cycle, it bottomed in September of 2019 and then double bottomed in December. But that bottom in September of 2019 happened to correspond again to when the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So I think there's this mistake a lot of people make in crypto where they think that ETH always outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market. And it does outperform Bitcoin in a QE bull market, right? When the Fed's printing money and everything is going up. But in QT bull markets, it underperforms Bitcoin. So that's the same thing we've been seeing, right? Quantitative tightening, ETH Bitcoin dropping. There's been all sorts of narratives why ETH
Yeah.
Bitcoin should go up, right? There's the merge, you have deflation, all this other stuff, but it never stopped ETH from bleeding against Bitcoin. And so it might just simply be ETH needs a change in monetary policy to bottom out. So that I think is what you look for. If once ETH Bitcoin starts going up, the rest of the altcoin market will likely follow along.
Is ETH just kind of dying over time, you think? If you take a look at the price year to date, it hasn't outperformed Bitcoin. It's actually down from its highs, unlike Bitcoin recently. If you take a look at some of the use cases, the meme coins are being built on things like Solana. So that's pumping because of the meme coin pump. Um, People are struggling to find a use case for ETH long term. And I'll let you comment on whether or not this narrative is true that ETH is just losing its relevance in the crypto world.
I don't think so. And look, like I've gotten a lot of hate over the last 3 years for being very bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation.
Hmm.
But
Well, you
I
weren't wrong. I mean, like it's gone down. So,
right. I mean, it has, but it's also important to remember that when you get to these extremes, like where it just bleeds for 3 years, this is what everyone always thinks, right? They think that it's dying and that it's losing relevance, that it'll never
mm,
come back. In reality, I do think Ethereum has a very bright future ahead of it. Um, you know, I think the issue is it is all comes down to monetary policy. I think that's the issue for ETH right now is that we haven't yet seen that transition. And so because of that, it just keeps on bleeding to the king. I mean, also the flows for the ETFs for Bitcoin have obviously been a lot stronger. Um, it's been easier to ride the Bitcoin dominance rally than to sort of hold ETH down when it's dropped against Bitcoin now, what, 60% over the last few years? But this is what always happens, you know? I mean, it always has these major drops. And, I don't know exactly when it's gonna bottom, but I could very well see the case that it bottoms within the next 2 months. I don't think it's gonna take that much longer. My guess is either by December or January at the latest. If I'm wrong, then it's probably because quantitative tightening just never ended and they just keep on extending it throughout 2025. So there is a reality where it could just keep going down even beyond what I thought what it was going to do. Remember, just because I've been right about it for the last couple of years doesn't mean
mm,
I'll time the transition perfectly. Um, but no, I think that it likely will bottom out relatively soon. I mean, you could always sort of draw these lines, try to connect the dots to try to give you the exact spot that it's going to bottom. I don't know exactly. My best guess, as I said for the last few years, is somewhere between zero
sure.
point 0.03 and zero point zero 0.04, and then it should start to go up.
Okay, 1 minute before we go, Ben, can you show us real quick the update to your portfolio optimization tool? What is it giving us now?
Yeah, so if we go over to modern portfolio theory, and this is the thing about it is, it's important to sort of predict out how it's gonna move. Right now, to maximize your Sortino ratio is 82% Bitcoin, 18% ETH. Right now, a couple years ago, David, this would have said probably closer to 60, 65, 35. But because it made sense to sort of be bullish on Bitcoin dominance, I've just been Bitcoin only essentially for the last few years. I've started to hedge with some ETH now, because I do think that ETH Bitcoin is near the bottom of its downtrend. In a year, my guess is that it'll probably be closer to say 70-30 in a year. So I'm gonna try to sort of keep that in mind. I'm nowhere near that level in my own portfolio. I'm still I've just been mostly Bitcoin for the last few
Hmm.
years, Bitcoin only, but I do think that things will start to shift in 2025, and we should start to see these numbers um, come back into better balance.
Excellent. Well, I'll put the link down below. If anyone's interested, check out Benjamin Cowen's Into the Cryptoverse platform. A lot of tools that we covered today and we haven't even covered yet. So lots to discover there. And of course, I mentioned Ben's YouTube channel down below as well. Thanks, Ben. Anywhere else we can follow you?
No, just on YouTube primarily and X. That's about it.
Great. Links down below. Thank you very much, Benjamin. We'll speak again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.